Welcome to this joint event at Birkbeck. It's been held by the Centre for British Political Life over in politics and jointly with the Centre for Contemporary Literature in English. My name is Ben Worthy. I'm the director of the Centre for British Politics, but I want to welcome both politics students and English students, as well as everybody else who's dropped in. So, by way of a welcome for Jaspreet, you're all, I'm sure, very familiar with her work. She is a poet, artist, activist, educator, and last but not least, the Birkbeck writer in residence for the politics department. Today, I want to have a conversation event with her where we're going to talk about her new memoir and manifesto, A Brown Girl Like Me. It's a book that aims, as you probably know, to empower and help South Asian women while also challenging many of the existing portrayals, stereotypes and oversimplifications. It's based both on the experience of her own life as well as interviews and examples and discussions with other activists. It will be available in all good bookshops soon. She very kindly sent me some exclusive extracts to read. I very strongly recommend it, and I have to say that it is not only beautifully written, but it also is an extremely positive book. So how we're going to do the session is I'm going to begin by asking a few broad kind of questions, and then I'm going to send it over to you to write any questions in the chat, which I'll then pitch over to her. So without further ado, Jaspreet, if you're there.
Hi Ben, thank you. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to put question one to you, and I'll keep an eye on the chat for when the questions come rolling in. So my first question is the big question, which is what inspired you to write this book, and where did you find inspiration, and also something you talk about in your book about sometimes the lack of role models when you were younger. Where did you find your role models?
I guess to start off about what inspired me to write this book and how Brown Girl Like Me first came about. I guess I'll start from where the journey began, and that was probably when I was a teenager, growing up in London, growing up in East London, born and raised, very proud East Londoner. I would say that I grew up in a part of London that was very diverse, very multicultural in East London. Grew up in a school that was very diverse, grew up with kids from every background, every faith. So I remember that feeling of feeling quite welcome, not feeling very othered in that sense of when I was in secondary school, kind of never noticed anything very different about myself at that point. But I remember when I then started to go to university and then started to go into the working world, I really felt this sense of erasure when it came to the brown woman's experience here in the UK. And what I mean by erasure is that I just didn't see our story being told anywhere, really. I couldn't see it in storybooks, I couldn't see it in non-fiction, I couldn't see it in historiography, and then I couldn't see it on TV screens and in mass media either. And that just seemed really strange to me, knowing that we as brown women exist here in the West and exist here in the UK, but our story and our experiences have never been shared. Or when they were shared, we see the same old tropes and the same old stereotypes coming out time and time again about what is an Asian woman. And I found that really exhausting. I found it so tiring and quite upsetting and frustrating, and going through that in my early 20s when I was at uni, and then going on to do my master's in gender studies. I was just getting kind of more and more frustrated and getting more and more angry about it. And I think I got to a point only a few years ago that I decided to stop complaining and start putting this story together myself. And that's when I started the research into the brown woman's experience here in the UK, but also in the Western world. And I wanted to look at what is it like for millennial women like myself that may have been born and raised here in the West and born and raised here in the UK, but how are we balancing these kind of intersectional parts of our identity. How do we balance it all? And I was just so sad to see that our story hadn't been told in this way before. So when I started digging into the research, the only book that I could find was back in 1979. It's actually here. It's Amrit Wilson's book, Finding a Voice, Asian Women in Britain, and that was published in the late 70s. And that was the last book that had this kind of story about South Asian women, that went across the country, interviewed women from Indian backgrounds, Bangladeshi backgrounds, Pakistani backgrounds, Sri Lankan backgrounds, and everyone who identifies as South Asian. And Amrit Wilson was the last person to do it, and that was over 40 years ago. And that just didn't sit right with me. So that's where the story of Brown Girl Like Me began. But also with my background of being a poet and being a teacher. So I've been teaching in secondary schools across London for the last 5 years. I teach history, sociology, and politics. Also those experiences I was seeing in education and on the ground in schools, that Asian girls, though they are the second smartest in the country academically, I felt that there was a real sense of kind of lack of confidence when I saw Asian girls in the classroom. And I was really interested in seeing how that translated in wider society as well. Why is it that we don't see brown women in politics? Why is it that we don't see brown women at board level positions? What is going on there? And a lot of that was coming down to and being pinned to ideas of the home and culture and family. But I knew there was so much more than that. I knew it couldn't have just been those tropes that are always attached to brown women. And that's where the research began, and that's where Brown Girl Like Me began. But I guess when I think about role models, I think it kind of goes hand in hand with that. It's the fact that I couldn't see mainstream role models. And what I mean by that is I couldn't see brown women on TV screens, in film, in literature, and definitely not in the school books and the history books as well. So it was hard to find role models there. But on the other hand, I had role models in my family. I had incredibly strong, brilliant brown women in my family that I would consider my role models. I saw them in books in the home. My dad was a huge fan of history himself. So in the home, we would have history books and literature from brown authors, black authors. So I would see those kinds of books around my house, but I just didn't see them anywhere else. So it was interesting that all the role models I could find were mainly in the home and not outside of that. But now, by doing this book and interviewing women across the country, from every age demographic, I've been speaking to brown women as young as the age of 16 all the way up to, I think one of our eldest interviewees was in her mid-90s. So we've got a real range of age demographics there, and I found so many role models when I spoke to these women across the country, and they do exist, and they are here, and they are in every single industry if we look for them and we find them. And it's about time we hear their story. So that's what Brown Girl Like Me, I hope it can do, and I hope that when other people hopefully read this book and buy this book, they won't feel that same feeling I felt as a teenager, and they'll no longer feel that sense of feeling both seen and unseen, this sense of feeling hyper visible, because everybody loves to create some stereotypes and tropes about brown women, but at the same time invisible, that we feel like we're not being seen at all. And I hope nobody else ever feels that way again.
That's really interesting. I actually, when I was reading through what you sent me, I actually circled the phrase seen and unseen, because it's a really interesting way of thinking about this kind of dual experience that happens simultaneously. I was going to ask you more a question about craft and process now. How did you go about researching both your own past and the history here? And how easy or difficult it was? And I mean, both for you personally, obviously it's a very strange feeling. You spoke in your newsletter about how odd it was to go back into your own past and pull these fragments together. Plus, how easy and difficult it was in lockdown as well.
Yeah, so I guess that was one part I did not expect, that there was going to be a worldwide pandemic the year that I decided to get on with this book and write this book. So there's definitely been some barriers there, because I guess I romantically imagine the fact that I'd be traveling across the country and meeting all these women in their natural habitats and in their spaces, and going across the country to interview these women. But obviously this last year and in these last 12 months, that wasn't possible. So a lot of those conversations had to happen digitally, which was something that I didn't quite expect. But in a way, that actually worked out really well, because I guess with it being digital, it made it a lot more accessible for me to reach women through social media, being able to interview them in a more accessible way over the phone, Skype, Zoom, all those sorts of things. So I kind of had to pivot and alter the way that I was planning to do those interviews, obviously, because I didn't know that this was going to happen in this last year. But in terms of the writing process and how I decided to go about it, I guess I already knew which key themes I really wanted to focus on. I knew I wanted to dive into the mental health experience for brown women. I knew I wanted to look at the school and education. And then I wanted to go on that journey of the steps that a brown woman usually has to take, and that starts with the home, then thinking about school, then the workplace, and the book really kind of navigates through all those different spaces and explores those different themes and areas for brown women. So yeah, I guess I didn't expect to be writing it in a worldwide lockdown, and in terms of resources, there was a bit of a struggle kind of getting access to things. But thankfully, with a lot of libraries and a lot of archives then moving a lot of their work online and a lot of their stuff online, that made it a lot more accessible for me to find the resources I needed, to find the statistics I needed. So yeah, it was just kind of a matter of pivoting my original approach. And then I guess the blessing in disguise was the fact that because I was at home with no other distractions, the rest of the world had slowed down. It gave me the time to just kind of sit there and focus and go into that deep work, and go into what I know other writers and other researchers talk a lot about when they're doing their work, or they're doing their research, that you need to go into this kind of process of deep work. And I'm a big believer in that. I feel if you really want to give your all for a piece of work, that deep work is really needed, that kind of sense of no distraction, no other things kind of taking your attention too much. So in a sense, in the last 12 months, that kind of helped, that there wasn't much else to do. There was nowhere to go. I was locked in our house anyway. So it allowed me to really dive in and get into that deep work. But what I didn't expect was, and I've only really been reflecting on this in the last couple of weeks now that I finished the first draft of the manuscript, is I didn't expect the book to be so healing. And I know that sounds quite spiritual and it sounds quite deep, but I didn't expect it to be such a spiritual process, and such a healing process for myself. Because like you said, Ben, I was digging out a lot of memories that I think I just pushed to the very back of my mind, so that I could just make it through day-to-day life. Because I think as some of those experiences I talk about as a teenager, some of those experiences I touch on in my early 20s, were things that I just kind of pushed to the back of my head. But when I'm reflecting on them in the book, it did resurface a lot of pain. It resurfaced a lot of trauma, and writing that all out, as well as talking to other brown women about them, was so healing. And when I finished that last chapter and finished that conclusion and was kind of really happy with that first draft, it literally felt like a huge weight had been lifted. And I didn't expect that. I guess I expected the feeling of feeling like, oh, I've accomplished a piece of work. I was kind of expecting that feeling, but not this feeling of healing. And I definitely mentioned that in the book, this sense of our generation are the generation of healing. And I touch on topics like intergenerational trauma, and some of those pains and traumas that we may have adopted from our parents and from our grandparents' generations, and how we now, as kind of second, third wave migrants, or the children or grandchildren of those migrants, are now trying to heal from a lot of those pains that maybe our parents and grandparents went through, but also our own pains of the things that we may have had to go through in our life as well. So yeah, I didn't expect that for it to be so healing.
It's very interesting because there's lots of incidents that clearly you've recalled in your own life. And it's interesting to see you writing about it now that you're older and looking back on it. And I've got to say that some of the incidents, even though they may have seemed at the time kind of rather minor, a comment from a teacher or something overheard somewhere else, some of them are very shocking now. And you can see how that process, you know, it can be healing in a sense, but also the sense that you're probably had pushed these to the side, to the back of your mind, hadn't fully remembered them. If I could just follow up, Deborah has asked a question in the chat, which kind of matches up with this. When you mention archives and you talk about going back in history, how far did you kind of go back? Who did you speak with? You know, when you said that you spoke to somebody in their 90s, you know, did you delve into the archives? Where did you go with your research that kind of blends both your own and other lives?
So I guess I should mention it. My background academically is in history, so I'm an avid historian, and obviously went on to teach history at secondary level. So you will see that there's history weaved throughout the book, and I definitely wanted that sense of history to really be within the book, and also mention the histories of amazing brown women, not only here in the UK but globally, who I felt their histories just had to be in this book. Whether that was brown women in the suffragette movement, whether that was brown women at the front lines of social justice movements and revolutions. I've mentioned some of those kind of historical figures, brown women, in the book as well, because, like I mentioned before, their historiography is often ignored from mainstream history. So those bits of history are weaved into there too. And I guess when I mention archives, I was looking into as far back as even the colonial period of looking at women's experience, both in India, but also kind of post-colonial period of Indian women and brown women migrating here to the UK. So I was using archives at the British Library and a number of different libraries here in the UK to kind of dig out some of those resources, but also over in South Asia as well. So looking into any archives I could find there about kind of personal experiences. So yeah, I guess I go as far back as the colonial period, and looking at the impact of empire, not only in South Asia, but what does that mean today, and how are some of those kind of legacies living on, both negative and positive, how are they still living on in us today? So yeah, I guess that's definitely the historian in me that comes out a lot in the book. And I'm afraid there's a lot of history jokes in there as well, guys, so I'm sorry about that, but I love a good pun and I love a good history joke, so you'll find quite a few of those in the book as well.
The best sort of jokes. One final question from me, and then I'll go over. There's some questions coming in the chat. Please keep them coming. I wanted to ask you how you blended the kind of two aspects of the book, because obviously it's both a memoir and a kind of manifesto. And I wondered, how easy was it to balance those two things? Because in some senses they're two very different things to write. And I'm thinking of some of the kind of inspirational books from the 20th century that did talk about people's own childhood and development through a political lens. And I think the two I picked up on recalled was Malcolm X's autobiography. Yeah. And George Orwell wrote an essay called Such Were the Joys, about his experience at a pretty horrific prep school. I wonder, how easy was it to strike that balance and feel that you were doing justice to both things that you were doing?
I'm glad you mentioned those two names, actually. So Malcolm X, George Orwell. I'd say there's quite a few black feminists during the 70s and 80s that kind of followed this similar style of kind of memoir manifestos, like Audre Lorde, more recently people like Bell Hooks. So I think I really was inspired by that style and resonated with that style a lot, just because I feel, especially for women of color and women from marginalized communities, our personal experiences and the things that we live through, they are political, whether we want them to be or not. And I touch on that in a number of different ways in the book, that even our bodies are political, whether we want them to be or not. Our mental health journey is political, whether we want it to be or not. So in a way, it was quite easy to weave those two things together by looking at these personal experiences and my own anecdotal stories throughout the book. But then what I tried to do was deconstruct those, as well as applying those to historical theories, political theories, social theories, to really get to the crux of why do these things happen to us, or why do we experience these things. So I think those things kind of flow within one another quite naturally, and hopefully it doesn't seem too segregated when people are reading the book, that it actually kind of flows quite nicely between anecdotal stories and then historical, political and social theory kind of woven throughout it all, because even our existence is political. And I know that sounds quite heavy, and it is a heavy kind of label or responsibility to hold, but I feel that is the experience of women of color, not only in here in the West, but also in other parts of the world as well.
And I have to say, you know, these are huge issues, but the way in which it's written, it's not that way at all. It's really, really beautifully written. Raphael has a question, which is very interesting, which is, how would you compare your book with the book from 40 years ago? To what extent are there similarities, and to what extent is it different? We always pride ourselves in every age that this age is different and more progressive and ahead. Yeah. How do you feel looking back on the books from before and what your own book says?
I guess the major distinction between now and then, I guess the stories that Wilson was reflecting on in Finding a Voice were women that had just migrated to the UK. So these are South Asian women who had literally just migrated to the UK within that kind of last decade. So their stories were very different in the sense that the experiences that they had to go through, what I think at certain times much more difficult. And what I mean by that is that they had to experience violence in a very different way to maybe how we are experiencing it now. And that's something I mentioned in the book, and really emphasize that the fact that I recognize that we as brown women may not have to experience the same direct violence that these brown women did when they first migrated here in the late 60s and 70s, and because of kind of the racial politics at the time, their experiences were much more difficult, and there were, I guess, bigger concerns to assimilate. And I share my mum's story a lot in the book about when she had to migrate here in the late 70s. Even she felt that she really did have to assimilate a lot more than maybe we do now. And what I mean by that is, we grew up in East London. We used to have a corner shop, fulfilling the stereotype for a lot of brown folk, but we used to have a corner shop. And Mum would be at the till day in, day out. And she would have to experience that direct violence almost on a daily basis, and have to experience racial slurs all the time, or not feel safe being able to wear a salwar kameez back then. And I remember her telling me stories of her trying to save up money to buy a pair of jeans, or she'd wear a jacket over her clothes so she didn't have to deal with that on a daily basis. Whereas now I appreciate we don't have to experience that same amount of violence and danger. But there are a lot of similarities too, that even now we do feel we have to blend, and we still may feel we have to assimilate. And I touch on in the book that the fact that when I was a teenager, I so badly wanted to be white, and that's something that I only now have really understood about why did I feel this sense of self-hatred about being a brown woman? Why did I not want to exist in this body? And it was because everything around me was telling me that white women were beautiful, and that white women were successful, and being a white woman was the way to be. And that goes as far back as I'd say as a child. Like I would write short stories and all the names would be Hannah, and they'd be Rebecca, and they'd be Sarah, and they would be blonde, and they'd have blue eyes, and they would eat English food, whatever that means. And that's what I would write about, because that's all I would see and that's all I wanted to be. And even as a teenager, I was probably a bit of a rebellious teenager, wanting to reject my culture and my traditions then as well. And that went on for quite some time. It was only in my 20s that I really wanted to reconnect with who I was, and wanted to reconnect with my identity, and what it meant to be a brown woman, and everything that encompasses that. So yeah, I think there's definitely differences between this book and the stories told in Amrit Wilson's book back in the late 70s, but there are some similarities there too, and I want to emphasize that in the book, that even though we are now living in this new decade post 2020, there are still parts of our culture and our traditions that I want us to lean into, and I don't want us to reject them. And that's something I really wanted to emphasize in the book, that you can be a brown, feminist, independent woman, but you can still uphold your culture and traditions. And unfortunately, I'd say that because of perhaps feminism in the West and white feminism, what has happened in the last decade is we've seen that that type of feminism has told women of color, specifically brown women, that to be a feminist and to be independent and those sorts of things, you need to reject your culture and traditions. You need to reject all those things and move closer to whiteness. But what I'm trying to show in this book is, no, you don't. That in fact, our cultures and traditions and beliefs and everything that makes us brown can also be incredibly empowering. And I know it has been for me. So yeah, I want to kind of challenge some of those perspectives and challenge some of those narratives that we've seen in recent years about brown women.
It's really interesting. One of the points you come back to in the book is challenging this what sounds like a very old phrase now about being between two cultures, which is a phrase that has lots of assumptions kind of baked right into it. Did you want to elaborate a little bit on that idea?
Yeah, and it's exactly that I say in the book, that I'm so tired of this between two cultures analogy, that apparently brown women are stuck between East versus West, and civilized versus uncivilized, and oppressed and free. And I felt like that is not actually reality. And I felt like that trope was really tiring, because what it was doing was in fact just marginalizing brown women even more. So that's why I kind of wanted to move away from that quite tired lens when people were looking at women of color, and specifically brown women. And I was kind of tired of that same kind of trope being told time and time again. And we're still seeing it today. We still see it in films. We're still seeing it on TV screens, that when we do make it to some of those mainstream platforms, that they're still telling those same tired kind of stories. And we're just bored of it. I want to see more nuance than that. And I want to see all those different things that make up brown women, and those stories really being told in authentic and beautiful ways. But the problem is having the opportunity to do that, and getting through the door and being able to share those stories is the difficult part. Even getting to where I am today and being able to publish this book was not an easy journey. It was a journey of almost 3 to 4 years to eventually get to this point, to get it published. And that is part of the problem. That's why we don't hear these stories authentically, or we're not getting to see all these nuances, because there's so many doors in the way before we can.
I've got another question in the chat, and please keep the questions in the chat coming from Sam. She wanted to ask about the generational differences in the ways in which women talked about their identities and their relations to wider society. Was there kind of stark differences between the generations, or were there similarities and themes that continue to crop up?
I guess one of the biggest similarities is some of the conversations about the home are still very similar. This ongoing sense of son preference is still very similar, which is such a shame to see, that we're still seeing this ongoing son preference in South Asian communities, that they want sons over daughters to carry on the family name. Economically, there's reasons for it. Financially, there's reasons for it. But we're still seeing those things continue. We're still seeing stigma around mental health. We're still seeing stigma around divorce. And all these kind of taboo topics are still being stigmatized even 40 years on, 50 years on. So there's definitely still similarities there. So those conversations around things going on in the private sphere, in the home, were still quite similar. I guess some of the differences is obviously now living in this digital age, and living in this world of social media and in this digital space, means that our experiences as brown women are very different now to what they were 40, 50 years ago. And I guess that's where some of the biggest differences arise about the impact of the digital age on brown women. And that's only quite a recent thing. So I'd say in the last decade, in the last 10 years, with the growth of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and more recently TikTok, brown women are now using these spaces to share their story. Because, like I mentioned before, other doors are closed to us, and now the digital world has perhaps given us a voice and it's unmuted us. So I think that's perhaps one of the biggest differences, and I touch on that in one of the chapters of the book about the power of the digital age and what that has meant for brown women in this kind of fourth wave feminist movement. Where do we fit into that space? But also the dangers of it as well, and how even though the digital space has given us so much power, it is also bringing on a lot of pain as well. Being in the digital world, and even things that I've experienced myself on social media, there are still people that want to mute women of colour. And I've personally been subject to troll attacks, to abuse online. So there's definitely the negative side to the digital world as well that I touch on. So I want to kind of explore that a lot more, about how now in this kind of fourth wave of feminism, potentially moving into this fifth wave, how can we as brown women make sure we kind of navigate the digital space safely, but not rely on that as our only way to share our story, and not rely on that as our only form of activism. Because unfortunately, these apps, these websites, they were not made for us, and they were not made for our liberation. They were not made to give us freedom. They are social media apps after all. And there's the whole saying that if anything's free, then it's most likely that you are the product. And we know in recent years there's lots of talk now about cyber snooping and data mining and what they are now doing with that data. So I think now we need to start having discussions about the fact that, yes, it did give us a voice, and that's been incredibly empowering in this last decade for brown women. Even myself, I wouldn't be here today without social media, because even my journey as a poet and as a writer really began online, and that was the first place that I could share my work and share this kind of portfolio of everything that I'm doing, because I wasn't able to do it in other ways. And that was where I could start my activism and start having these conversations to challenge and to discuss things. But now I think it's about time we start having the discussion of what happens next. How can we continue to do it safely, but how can we make sure we're not relying solely on this digital world? But yeah, that's I guess one of the biggest differences from those older generations to perhaps more kind of millennial and Gen Zers, that we're now living in this digital world. So how do we navigate that?
You write very, very movingly about how you've used social media, and it's extremely interesting now. And I might revisit that if that's okay. Not just your experience, but also lots of other activists and groups who actually made some very interesting use of social media. And just going to go over to one of the questions in the chat. What kind of challenges were you confronted with throughout the kind of research and writing process? What were the major things that were difficult?
The major things that were difficult, I guess, trying to stay relatively sane in this pandemic was probably one of them. Just the fact that I was staying in the same room day in, day out, writing this book, was one of the things that I had to navigate and work out about. How do I make sure I'm still looking after my well-being whilst I'm writing this book? And like I said, it was resurfacing a lot of trauma. It was resurfacing a lot of pain, things that I had kind of hidden away inside my head for quite some time. So I guess that was one of the biggest aspects of it, of even during this writing process. How did I look after my well-being? And as somebody with a history of anxiety attacks and a history of depression, I needed to make sure that during one of the most difficult years of everyone's lives, how am I still looking after myself? So I was putting a few things in place to make sure I was doing that. I was going for daily walks. I have a dog, so that was great. He made sure he got me out of the house at least twice a day and to go for a nice long hour walk. I'm a big fan of meditation and yoga, so I would try and implement that every morning, as well as going for a run and working out when I could. So that aspect of it, of looking after my well-being whilst writing this book, was a really big part of it. But some of the other challenges were obviously kind of accessing resources, not being able to physically go to places that I may have needed to go to, not being physically able to go meet the people that I wanted to interview, was a downside as well. And but the plus side of it is that I'm so excited that when things do open up again, I'm hopefully going to be able to go meet these women face to face, which is going to be quite an exciting thing, that I can actually hand them the book and hand them this piece of work when things are hopefully a little bit more normal. So yeah, I guess that was some of the challenges, kind of access to things physically, but also that side of well-being and looking after myself when I wrote this. And then I guess also the time frame of writing it within 12 months. Even though the book itself and the ideas were something I was putting together for many years, and kind of pulling things of some of my previous bits of work together, in terms of actually writing this book, I was signed last May of 2020. That was announced in June. And I had till February to complete my first draft. So that's actually less than 12 months. What is that? That's 6, 7, 8, 9 months I had to complete the entire manuscript. So that meant writing day in, day out. And on average, I was completing a chapter every 3 to 4 weeks. So imagine a dissertation every 3 or 4 weeks. That's the only way I could kind of compare it to what the amount of writing and research.
I can feel all the academics sweating as they're listening to that set of deadlines. I'm always reminded of the Douglas Adams quote where he said he loves deadlines. He loves the whooshing sound they make when they go past. I wonder if I can just press you a little bit on this, because I've got a sense that lots of people listening are people who write a lot or want to write a lot or have to write a lot. And do you have any kind of tips for how you keep momentum as well? I mean, obviously with a tight deadline like that, you have to keep momentum. But do you have any kind of writer tips for how you keep going and how you organize it and how you do it?
Yeah, I guess my process is a little bit boring. I hope it doesn't sound too boring. So my process was, I kind of roughly knew what the themes of the chapters were going to be. So when I would start a chapter, I'll literally just have a mind blur. And what I mean by that is I just write down all the thoughts and feelings and ideas that were coming to me about that particular theme or topic. So let's say it's the mental health chapter, which is one of the starting chapters of the book. So I'd write down all my thoughts, feelings, ideas for that particular chapter. A lot of those things would be anecdotal, so they would be some of my own experiences, and I'd just kind of blurt that all out first. From that point onwards, I then start doing kind of more of the concrete research. And that's when I would start looking at historical theory, political theory, social theory, looking at other experts who in that space and what they've written, trying to pull a lot of those sources and ideas together. And that would be kind of the reading and the research stage. And that's when I would spend a good couple of weeks reading through all those different sources and bits of information and gathering that bits of evidence. Alongside that would also be the interview process. And that's when I would find the interviewees for each of those chapters. And I did that in a number of different ways. So women that I knew personally, women that I could find online, and then kind of a bit of a snowball sample as well. So the women that I did speak to would recommend if they knew any other experts in the space or knew any other people with personal experiences in that space. But this is where social media was a big blessing, and this is where one of the positives of social media in the digital age was that when I needed interviewees or I needed to speak to people, social media was a great way for me to find women. So I'd put posts out online, lots of people would get in touch, they would tag people that they thought would be great for it, I would reach out to them or they'd reach out directly to me if they wanted to be a part of the book, and that's where the interview process would start. And that would all happen obviously digitally because of this last year, would be over phone calls, Skype and Zoom. And then once I collated all that together and collated those interviews, it was then part of just sitting there and writing. And those first drafts of the chapters are always a mess. They're always a bit everywhere. Paragraphs might not flow, they may seem a bit chunky, but I would just kind of start that writing process of bringing all that kind of information that I'd collated, kind of my personal stories, the research, and then the interviews, collating those things all together. And that's where I would kind of figure out a mind map for each chapter of, okay, how would I like this flow of each chapter to go? Because they all have a flow of a story. They start and end a little bit like a story. And by the end of the chapter, I really want people to feel like they feel heard, and that they can resonate with a lot of the experiences in that chapter, but also can go away with some tools about how they can take on some of those challenges for those particular themes, and some takeaways at the end of those chapters. And that's why I guess I've been calling it a bit of a manifesto. Other people have been calling it a call to arms, because there are active things that I want people to go away and do after they read this book.
That's very interesting that you kind of collect the ideas and then kind of roll a narrative onto it. I wonder if I want to ask you another question from Yanthi, which you touched on there, which is what role did you talked about the role that your background as a historian played. What about any gender studies ideas and theories? What role did they play in how you wrote?
Yeah, so that definitely made a huge part of the book. And obviously, as an avid feminist and somebody that went on to study gender studies, there's a lot of gender theory in there, and I feel like I've kind of woven that in quite naturally throughout the book as well. And what I wanted to make sure with the gender theory was that I wanted to bring in lots of feminists that people may have not heard of before. So you will see names in there that perhaps aren't the kind of forefront feminist names that people have seen beforehand, and that's because I wanted black feminists in there, I wanted brown feminists in there, and I wanted their political theories within the book too. So yeah, a lot of that is weaved throughout the book, and you'll definitely get a feeling of that kind of gender political theory in there and that gender social theory in there. And because I then went on to teach sociology as well, there are anecdotal stories of when I taught sociology in the classroom, the reactions I would get from students. many of the sociology classes that I had were predominantly Asian girls. It's quite a popular subject choice for Asian girls across the country. And I remember when I would teach them a lot of these things to do with gender, to do with education, to do with cultural capital, social capital, teaching them all these theories in sociology or in gender. I could literally see these students sitting there and applying them to their own lives and applying it to themselves. And my classroom always became a place to have debates and have discussions and to have dialogue, but it was also a safe space for those girls and those students to stick around after class, hang out there at break time and at lunchtime to carry on talking about a lot of those things. And I share those experiences in the book about those conversations I had with my students about these things. And I remember feeling at that time as a teacher, sometimes feeling really powerless and feeling like I understand and emphasize what these girls are going through, and I really resonate with what they're going through, but how can I help them? I really want to make them feel more empowered and make them feel like they have so many opportunities that they can go on and take. But I remember in the classroom, that always felt so difficult because I'd be teaching them things that they would be feeling like applied to their own lives. And one of the examples I give in the book of when I was teaching them the theories of cultural capital and social capital, and how some people will have the cultural and social capital of having networks and having connections that will help them later on in life. Their parents might know someone who can get them a really good job, or know someone in a company that could get them in a good job. But also kind of that cultural capital of how to behave in interviews and how to conduct yourself, and all those sorts of things. And I remember having conversations with some of those girls, and they would be saying to me that they don't have those things. We don't have those connections. We don't have those networks, same way that I didn't growing up either. And that's why in the book I talk about how can we tackle some of those things, and I talk about the importance of mentoring, I talk about the importance of role models, I talk about how women like myself or women further on in their careers, how important it is for those brown women to come support younger brown women, whether that's through mentoring, whether that's connecting to schools, or whether that's even in the home, and looking closer to home about young brown women and their families or their nieces, their daughters, and thinking about how they can support them as well. I mentioned that a lot in the book about how a lot of these big things that I'm talking about tackling, and these kind of societal injustices that I'm talking about tackling, often start at home. And there's that famous saying, and my dad used to say it all the time as well, that charity starts at home. And the way that I interpret that phrase, or interpret that saying, is the fact that a lot of these conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, start within the home. And that's definitely difficult for brown girls to have some of these conversations in the home. And I've given some advice on how we can do that and how we can start navigating that. I call them awkward dinner table conversations, because that's literally what they are. A lot of these conversations that I had to have perhaps with my parents, or my family growing up, were these kind of awkward dinner table conversations where we're tackling kind of really big stigmatized topics, maybe mental health, maybe things to do with gender, but having them at a dinner table or having those discussions over cups of tea can really start to make this change and really start to make these differences.
And tea also plays rather a big role in this process, doesn't it? I think we'll come back to that if that's okay. But
yeah, definitely.
Deborah just had a question about, could you say something about finding commonality while at the same time acknowledging diversity in the South Asian community, which is part of this stepping away from some of these stereotypes or some of these sort of binaries through which we see these discussions?
Yeah, one of the big things I emphasize right at the start of the book, and I try to emphasize it throughout, that even though I'm talking about brown women and South Asian women, we are not one collective group. We are made up of so many different types of South Asian women from very different demographics, very different cultural backgrounds, very different traditions, different faiths. So I'm not trying to chunk us all into one group, and I kind of unpack that a little bit right in the introduction, because I want to make it clear that that's not what I'm trying to do. What I've tried my best to do is for those women who identify as brown and identify as Asian women, I've tried to collate as many of those experiences as possible. That's why for each chapter, I made sure that my sample was made up of a diverse number of age groups, diverse demographics, women that were Pakistani, women that were Bangladeshi, women that were Indian, women that were Sri Lankan, women that were also from, well, for their families, maybe from Nepal, because they also identified as brown. We had women whose families were from East Africa because of the South Asian migrants that moved over to Kenya and Uganda. So I recognize it is not one group, and I kind of convey that diversity as much as I can throughout the book, and those nuances that I mentioned earlier, that I want to convey all those different nuances and different experiences. But then again, we have, because of this kind of some of these cultural similarities, specifically by being a girl or being a woman, those kind of similarities are the ones that are also weaved into the book. That's where the kind of commonality comes from it. So yeah, it was trying to balance this sense of togetherness and sisterhood and solidarity, but also that we're also individuals, and we're also very different people, and there's also so many other things that make up our identities other than being brown. We are also so many other things. We have so many other passions and interests, and sometimes I get tired of just having to be the brown woman. I'm also just Jaspreet. I'm also a wife. I'm also a daughter, a sister, an auntie, and all those things too. So I want to show as much of that as I can in the book.
One of the questions that's come up in the chat is also about the discussion about inequalities right now during the pandemic. At certain points, I kept feeling that there was going to be a big discussion about inequality in Britain because of what's been raised by the pandemic. And then at other points, I think, no, maybe this is just not going to take place. Do you have any thoughts about whether there's a sort of permanent change going to happen about inequalities, a deeper discussion is going to happen, whether what's happened with the pandemic has advanced how we talk about inequality in society in all these different ways, or do you think not? I know that's a big question.
It is a big question, and something I had to consider whilst I was writing it, that did I want to make it a book about the pandemic, or did I want to make it a book about a book that was written in COVID time, or did I want it to be a book that can exist within that time but also make sense in 5 years time, 10 years time as well? But there's lots of references obviously to the pandemic and to COVID in the book, because I felt like I couldn't not mention them, because this year has shown us significant amounts of inequality, and how this pandemic has impacted women disproportionately, and how this pandemic has impacted women of colour disproportionately. And sadly, the way that ethnic minorities have been treated during this pandemic has been horrific. It's been disgusting. Even some of the articles that have come out today about how ethnic minorities are targeted and treated, despite the fact, when we look at the numbers of ethnic minorities that were at the front lines, working in the NHS, and how that gets completely neglected. So many of those conversations have come up in this last year, and obviously because of the height of the Black Lives Matter movement last May, a lot of these conversations had to come to the forefront and force people to have these uncomfortable conversations that were needed for a very, very long time. So in a way, light at the end of the tunnel, a bit of a positive thing that has come out of 2020, is something that I kind of call this 2020 vision. And I mean that in two senses, that having a 2020 vision is seeing something with absolute clarity. I'm someone who has terrible eyesight, so I know a lot about vision. So having 2020 vision would mean that you've got great eyesight and that you can see things from far away and you can see your eyesight is good and it's strong. I hope that this last year has given us this 2020 vision in the way that we look at society, in the way that we treat one another. I hope from some of these lessons we've learned in this last year, we can see the realities clearer, and with that sight and with that clearer vision, we can go forward as a better society and tackle these issues. And I see some change happening, and that's where I feel a sense of hope, and I feel a sense of positivity, that there are major changes happening in the education space. We're seeing changes in the workplace. We're seeing kind of CEO level kind of people even having discussions about race and gender in a way that they've never done before. So I think there is a shift happening, but we've still got a long way to go, a long way to go, unfortunately. But I'm hoping that we do go forward with this 2020 vision, and a lot of these things don't get brushed under the carpet again, because they're right in front of us, and there's no way to ignore them anymore.
Okay, I'm conscious we've kept you talking for an hour, so I'm going to ask you a few final questions. You've talked a lot about what you want people to take from the book, and you've hinted at some tips and things that you'd like people to do. Could you tell us a little bit more both about what you'd like people to do, and also if you have any other advice, particularly about being an activist, not just in the media but also on social media?
Oh yeah, really good question. One of the biggest messages from the book, and this is kind of an overarching one throughout the book, is how ultimately brown women and all women really need to think about how they can develop this sense of self-love. And that word gets thrown around a lot these days, and it gets thrown around a lot on social media about self-love and what does that mean. But what I'm hoping to explain in the book is that by centering ourselves, it does not make us self-centered. And what I mean by that is, rather than trying to fulfill so many expectations and to fulfill so many other standards, or like I was saying, trying to be someone else, what we ultimately need to do is build this internal self-love for who we are. And I kind of have weaved that throughout the book about how we can actually do that. And a lot of that comes through education, and that sense of learning and self-education that is required so that you can love who you are and so that you can love your identity. Because when you haven't been handed all the facts about yourself, when you've been given half of your own story, or you've only been given bits of your own history, how can you know who you are, and how can you love who you are if you don't have all those facts and haven't been given all that knowledge? So one of the main things in the book is this self-education, and I'm encouraging brown women to read, and that's fiction, that's non-fiction, that's history, that's literature, to really understand who we are, as well as listening to other people's experiences too. So there's a big part of those tips that I'm providing about how to do that self-education, how to perhaps do, even again with the puns, I talk about doing shelf reflections. And what a shelf reflection is literally going around your house, looking at your shelves, looking at your bookcases, and considering the books that you read. Are they diverse? Do you have a range of writers from different backgrounds, sharing different stories and different histories? Doing that shelf reflection really makes a big difference. Even with our media online, have you diversified your media? Are you reading information and taking sources from different places, or are you falling into these echo chambers that are just telling you the same stuff that you want to hear? Is something to consider, and how to diversify your media. But in terms of activism, like I mentioned before, there's a huge way that we can be doing that online, and there is ways to perform your activism online, and there's a big part of allyship that comes through online work. So there's definitely power there. But I think when we hopefully start moving into this new reality of moving back into public spaces and being able to see one another again, we need to make sure this activism is also taking place offline as well. And this allyship and all those sorts of things that we're talking about on social media also happens in the real world too. And I'll give a quick example of that. In the book, I touch on quite a big issue within the South Asian community is the sense of anti-blackness and ongoing colorism that goes on in the South Asian community. And this was a big discussion that came up last year after the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, after May of last year. A lot of South Asian families were now having to have really difficult conversations about the fact that we do have anti-blackness in our community, and we do have this sense of colorism in our community, something that brown women have to deal with specifically, that darker brown women are treated very differently to lighter skinned brown women. I even talk about myself as a northern Indian woman coming from Punjab with a lighter skin tone. I recognize I have different privileges to brown women that have darker skin tones, and having those difficult conversations, but not only having them online, and it was great that people were having those discussions online, but are we having those discussions in our home? Are we having them in the offline world as well? So that's what I'm hoping to see, and that's what I'm encouraging in the book, that how do we take these discussions offline as well?
Oh, I just wanted to ask you finally just two things. The first thing, what next for you now? I mean, it must feel very strange, the first draft of the book's in. What else are you planning, and how can we keep track of what you're doing and follow what you're doing? I'm just going to post your website again into the chat just while you explain.
So what's next? A number of different things. So quite a few exciting bits in the pipeline. As well as writing this book this year, I have been working on a few other projects as well. I've been working on some screenplays. As a poet and as a writer, I do love writing in different forms. So there is the poetry that is continuing, and there's definitely lots of performances and shows coming up for the poetry, as well as new work that I'm writing in that space, but also exploring more script writing. So I'm currently working on my first short film. It's going to be my first script to screen project, and it's with CBBC, which is quite a nice project to be working on. But I guess in the short term, really thinking about how can I make sure that this book reaches as many people as possible. So that's what this kind of next 12 months is going to look like. Post that, I'm hoping to continue working on my poetry, because one of the biggest questions I got when I announced that I am working on a book, everyone was expecting a poetry collection, because that is what I also do, and I've been writing poetry since I was 13, 14 years old. So I've got hundreds and hundreds of poems waiting for the world to see. So I think the next chapter and the next step is now deciding what I would like to do with that poetry, which is quite exciting.
Wow, it sounds amazing. That all sounds brilliant. I've posted into the chat a link to your website where we can keep updated on what's happening. You've also got a newsletter, haven't you?
Yes, I have a monthly newsletter that goes out, so you can subscribe to that on the website. So yeah, that monthly newsletter will share everything I'm up to, upcoming events, performances, shows, but also other projects and charities that I might be supporting as well, and kind of how people can get involved with those things too.
And I've also put up your TEDx talk as well. So just to finish, I like to ask people for any recommendations, apart from your book, of course, coming soon and available in all good bookshops. Is there anything else that you'd recommend people could read? Any kind of important works? It can be pieces of art, books, films, yes. Anything that you'd want people to, if you could have people go away and do one or two things, watch or read or see one or two things, what would they be?
I guess I wanted to share some very recent books that I've been reading and recent publications, just because I feel they give quite an up-to-date, very post 2020 view and perspective on Brown experiences. So these are the three that I really wanted to recommend to everybody today. I think it was within the last month, Nikesh Shukla, who I'm sure lots of people might know about. He was the editor for The Good Immigrant that came out a couple of years ago. He released a memoir of race, family and home called Brown Baby. He is a father of two daughters, and this is an amazing book about kind of fatherhood, family. So yes, it's a really stunning memoir. It's Brown Baby by Nikesh Shukla. I'm also reading Arundhati Roy's new book. This is Azadi, and this is a really beautiful collection of essays about freedom, fascism, and fiction. So this is another big recommendation. I'm about 3/4 of the way through at the moment, but yeah, this is definitely one. Also, another one that I've just started, and this also came out recently, is Empire Land by Satnam Sanghera. He is famously known for his book, Boy with a Top Knot, and he is looking at imperialism and how it has shaped modern Britain. Obviously, because of these kind of ongoing discussions about empire in this last year, and discussions around how empire should be taught, decolonising the curriculum, and all those sorts of things. It's quite an interesting book, looking at kind of some of those recent views on empire. So that was another one I'd like to recommend. So yeah, that's a few from me. More recent texts that have come out, and these have literally all come out in the last couple of months. So those are the three that I wanted to suggest for everyone today.
That was wonderful. There's some great books recommended there. I've tried to put the links in the chat as you were speaking. So finally, I want to say what a huge privilege it is to be able to speak with you. What a huge privilege it is to have you as the writer in residence at Birkbeck. And I maybe just want you to leave us with one more promise, which is to come back and talk to us again later in the year, if you would, because it's been a great event, and I think we could all keep you here another hour or so. But we let everybody put their feet up, not least you.
Yeah.